So, welcome everyone. I'm Sampo Savolainen. I'm the managing director at Spatineo, and I'm responsible for the development of Monitor. So that's why I'm talking today. So the topic today, of course, is GDPR. So as well. So first of all, sorry to do this, but we're not a law and Spatineo Monitor. I cannot say that everything here is 100% as a lawyer would say that things are, but this is our interpretation. And as things are with the GDPR, a lot of lawyers are also saying that they don't really know what's going to happen. But this is based on what I've read, what I've talked to lawyers about this matter, and so on. So it should be very accurate. So first of all, just quickly, the General Data Protection Regulation. We have to remember that this is something which citizens, it affects all companies, organizations, whether they're public or private, who collect and process information about, well, it affects everyone, it affects youth in the world. What's really good about this legislation, in my opinion, is that it gives very clear definitions on the roles who are participating in the access and storage and use of private information. And also it gives somewhat clear rules on how to deal with data breaches, how to notify users and so on, and also with regards to what is the responsibilities of organization with the right to be forgotten and so on. And we have to remember that this legislation is already in place. It has been in place for quite a while, and to access deadline in the law becomes enforceable. So just a few core definitions, which is the most important things in today's discussion. The data subject is someone whose personal data is being processed. Personal data means anything that relates to a natural person or a data subject, and which can be used to identify a person, whether directly or indirectly. And then the data controller. Now that is the organization who sort of owns the well, not owns, but is responsible for collecting information. So how it's written here is entity that determines the purposes, conditions, and means of the processing of personal data. It's important to note here that this doesn't mean that the data controller necessarily, let's say, runs a database with personal information, but they're the party who is the reason why personal data is collected and processed and used. And then a data processor is someone who's not a data controller, but processes data on behalf of them. So if we look at this diagram here, we have a data subject, a user, someone who gives consent to someone to use their personal data. This could be someone subscribing to a newsletter, for example. The data controller is the organization who's responsible for that newsletter. They're the one who are going to be posting information to the subscribers of the newsletter, and they are holding, or they are controlling, a registry of personal data. They're the controller even if that registry would be a service outside of their domain, so to say. So, for example, MailChimp, which is a very widely used newsletter software, cloud software, that stores the personal data in their systems, but they are not, in fact, the data controller. The data controller is the party who has created the newsletter. And then the data processor is someone who's authorized by the data controller to process that information. So in this example, MailChimp would be the data processor, and the organization whose newsletter it is, that would be the data controller. And it's important that in GDPR, the data controller needs to obligate the data processor to follow follow the regulation in a sense. so that when the data controller is ultimately responsible for the data, they are also responsible for the data processors. So they must obligate the data processor to follow the law, so that if a data breach happens, the data processor is obligated to tell the data controller, and then the data controller is, of course, obligated to tell the data subjects. And then the definitions also clearly state that there is a sub-processor also. So it's always possible that these are linked, so that there's a controller, a data processor, and then a data sub-processor. So in the MailChimp example, this sub-processor could be, let's say, Azure or Amazon Web Services, if that is the service provider used by MailChimp or the newsletter software to run the service. And these obligations that are given to the data processor by the data controller should be also follow to the data sub-processors, so that the whole chain of entities processing that personal information have the same responsibilities, so that the end goal is that the data subject's rights are always followed, despite of how complex or what kind of data processing chain there is. Now, in relation to Spatineo Monitor, you are sending us log files, and these log files contain IP addresses of users. And at the moment, the way this has been, the way this is seen at the moment is that IP addresses need to be considered as personal data. And the reason for this is that even though not all of the IP addresses, but some of these IP addresses come from personal cell phones or personal home broadband connections. These connections may be, the ISPs know whose connections these are. So they are able to connect that IP address with a person who has been using it at the time. So this makes all IP addresses personal data, because some of those might be these dynamic IP addresses. Therefore, if a log file contains IP addresses, it must be treated as personal data. And you have to also remember that sometimes the log files may contain something else. They might contain, let's say, usernames or something like this, which can be connected to persons or data subjects. And it's important also to remember that, as the same as with IP addresses, the log file does not include the information who is this IP address or who is using this IP address. But in the same sense, a username, from the log file, you don't know from the username who that data subject is, who that private citizen is. But someone, the ISP or maybe you or someone else, has a database which connects this information to that person, then it has to be considered as personal data. So at the moment, what's happening is that you have spatial web services, and you have users who are accessing them, and that is producing the access logs. And now, based on the current way IP addresses are seen, they are considered personal data. And you are sending those files to us, to our upload service, which we then use to analyze the log files and produce data to the reports, to the tool for you to use. And in effect, what's happening is that this is making us a data processor, because that personal data is flowing to us and we are accessing it. But in fact, the service that you are getting from Spatineo Monitor is not related to those persons. There is nothing in Spatineo Monitor that looks at a single person. Personal data is never produced out of Spatineo Monitor. So in a sense, the fact that this information is sent to us, it's not actually necessary. So at the moment, we are still using that IP address information, but having the unique IP addresses is a different matter. But just so you know, what we are using it is, of course, to do statistical information on the analytics that we're providing. So we are looking at the location of the user so that we can produce information on which country they are coming from, and we are producing the map that you can use to look at which areas of the world the users are coming from. Then we're also analyzing what kind of organization or whether it's an ISP that the users are coming from. This is done using a reverse DNS lookup. And then we are also using these IP addresses to approximate the number of unique users that your service have. But these, as I said before, exact addresses are never shown in Monitor, and we never examine or identify a single user except for statistical purposes in calculating the number of unique users. Then when we look at the GDPR general principles, the idea is that personal information, as it is identifiable, should not be stored or processed for longer than it's actually relevant and necessary. And also, you should always minimize the amount of personal data that is stored and processed, so that there's all the principle of data minimification, so that a minimum amount of data is always stored. You never store anything extra, because extra would mean that you don't know what you're not using it. It would be extraneous. So how to comply with the spirit of the regulation? As I said, we don't really need the personal data to provide you with a service. And actually, as that personal information is sent to us, it's adding a burden to everyone. So it burdens you, since you need to, according to GDPR, you would need to obligate us to do all the things that the GDPR mandates, because we are data processors. And it, of course, it burdens us because we have to meet those expectations and those obligations. And because we don't really need the access to this. So we are trying to find out a way, or we're finding out, and I have a proposal here. But the idea was to figure out a way how to do this so that the service that you get out of Spatineo Monitor is only minimally affected. Limit the burden for everyone involved. It's easier for you. It's easier for us. It's better for the data subjects, because their information is not unnecessarily transferred to us. And in general, follow not just the letter, but also the spirit of the regulation, that we keep the data as minimum as possible. So the solution that I'm proposing is to anonymize. And by anonymizing, it means that the data, the IP address, is modified in a way that is no longer, that IP address can no longer be connected to a single person, that it cannot be used to identify what a single person has been doing, and cannot be connected to that single person. So we're proposing that we would build anonymization software that would process the log files that you have, and then after that processing, you would send that information to us. So you would no longer be sending the personal data to us. And the anonymization would happen, well, technically like this. So for IPv4 addresses, a certain number of bits would be taken out of the end of the address. For example, Google Analytics does this. They are taking out 8 bits, but I think even taking out 8 bits is a bit safe. You can probably go with 6 bits or 4 bits, because if you consider the IP address is personal information only because to a single person, if you take out, let's say, 4 bits, that's 2, 4, 8, 16. So that means that if you read for that single PSP of 16 people, so it's no longer connecting that information to a particular person. So we're considering that the tool would allow you to configure the number of bits to whatever is comfortable to you. And of course, the trade-off is that the more bits you take out, the less accurate our analysis can be. So the less accurate location, the less accurate unique number of users, and so on. Then for IPv6, which is still very rare, but we have to consider this as well. It's a bit more complex because the addresses are also a bit more complex. There is a part which identifies basically a computer, and then there's a part which identifies a network provider. And we're proposing that we would take out all of the 64 bits which identify the particular computer, and then also what is called a site topology, because the way this is seemed to be working, this is still a bit of guesswork because IPv6's rollout is still a bit slow. But currently, the way people see this is that an ISP would use the public topology plus a site topology to identify a single broadband connection or a single cell phone connection. So we would be taking out also the site topology, which would leave us, we would still be able to identify small companies, branches of large organization, and leaving definitely no way to identify a person, because that, well, because the interface ID is gone and the site topology is gone, there is no way that anyone could figure out who that user is. So the details, this would be a very simple tool. It would take a file as input and write an anonymized version of that as output. Your IT would have to modify the upload procedure so that this tool would be ran before the file is sent to us. And then really, I have some questions for you, like what kind of technology would you like to see this working on? We're thinking of maybe Python, maybe Java, or maybe providing a container version of it to make it really simple to run. Because both Python and Java have the problem that you need to have a runtime to run it. You need to have maybe some libraries and so on. But let's discuss this after I go through the presentation. So the schedule is once we're confident that this approach works for you and we know what technology to use, we would start the development as soon as possible. It's not a very complex tool to develop, so I would see that the preliminary version would be available for testing in March and April. And for this, I would be very interested to hear if there's anyone willing to be a guinea pig for this. And then, of course, this tool would be ready to use for you in May. On the other hand, you don't necessarily have to use this tool. For example, Microsoft provides a tool which you can use to just remove the IP addresses completely from the log files. But from our point of view, removing that removes too much information. The quality of the recording goes down quite a lot if you don't have the IP addresses in the log files. But that's also a possible choice. You can build this yourself. That's if your IT is not comfortable with the technology that we choose, or for whatever reason, maybe they are also anonymizing a lot of other things as well. So maybe they are more comfortable using their own solution for it, and that's completely fine with us. So that's all I had prepared, and I would really like to open the floor for discussion and thoughts on this idea. I'm just switch out.